Let us understand a two-dimensional array with help of an example, right? So this is an example of real world where we want to get marks of multiple students and each student learning multiple subjects. For simplicity, we will assume that all the students in a class are learning the same set of subjects. So if you want to store marks of multiple students for multiple subjects, then you need some kind of table like this, where that one row is representing each student. This is a roll number of the student, and columns are representing different subjects. So if I write 98 here, it means that student with roll number C002 have got 98 marks in physics, right? This is one way of representing it in table. Another way of representing it in table is have one row per subject and let column represent the student. So here one column will represent one student. So here writing 98 means roll number C002 got 98 in physics. So here number of rows will be equal to the subjects and number of columns will be equal to the number of students. But most of the time we represent this kind of data using this first table, where each row is representing one student and each column is representing subject. But in programming, definitely you can use the second approach as well, but we will stick with the first one. Okay, and then we will also calculate percentage of each student and also calculate average marks for each subject. Okay, so let us assume that number of students equal to 140. There are 140 students in a class, and the number of subjects they are studying is 3. So they are studying 3 subjects each. Each student is learning 3 subjects. Okay, now to store a table like this where we store marks, what would be the dimension? Definitely you might already have guessed it. We will not store roll number. We will derive roll number based on the index of the row. So in few minutes I will try to explain what I mean by that. And we will also not store the name of the subjects. We will only represent it with the subscript or the index, right? So to store, basically if you want to store marks of 140 students and each student having 3 subjects, and let's assume that marks are in whole numbers, so basically integers, then how many integers would you need? 140 students and each having 3 subjects. So 420 values or 420 integers you will need to store. So you can create single dimensional array for 420 values and do some mapping and use that, but that would not be understandable or readable code, right? So the right approach for this is to use two-dimensional array and have rows represent each student and have columns represent subject. So if we want to do that, and as we have said, the marks are in whole numbers, so we will take integer data type and we will call our name of the array marks and number of rows. Each row is representing one student. So how many rows will be required? 140, right? And number of columns is representing subjects. So how many columns we would require? 3, right? So we will need an array like this to store marks of all the students. So once we declare an array like this in C programming, it will allocate memory for 140 rows, right? So this this array has 140 elements in each, and each element is an array of 3 integers. So first element here is marks of 0. Basically it will store marks of student with roll number 1. Then we have the second element as marks of 1, which will store marks of roll number 2, and so on. So basically index plus 1. What is the relation between index and roll number? If you add 1 to the index, you will get the roll number of the student. You can think about it like this, right? Because in real world, mostly there is no roll number with value 0, and so on. So basically this will go until marks of 139, which would, that final row will store marks of the last student with roll number 140. Okay, and each of these students have 3 subjects, right? So here marks of 0 is marks of roll number 0 for subject which we are using index 0 for, right? Then this would be marks of 01, this would be marks of 02. So marks for roll number 1 for subject at index 0, index 1 and index 2. We will not remember the name of the subjects for simplicity in C program, right? Similarly, this would be marks of roll number 2 and so on. Okay, so this kind of array we will get. Though this is just a visual or conceptual representation, right? I hope everybody understands by now that arrays are stored in memory in sequence, right? Our memory, computer memory, sequential memory, it does not have these 2 dimensions, right? So what it will do instead is it will store these marks in sequence. So starting from some address, it will start, let's say this 3, right? This is marks of 0, and this is marks of 00, marks of 01, marks of 02, and each of these is one integer. So it will consume 4 bytes. For most compilers will allocate 4 bytes for one integer, right? And then there would be marks of 1, marks for roll number 2 at index 1, right? So something like this. And then there would be marks of roll number 3 with index 2, and so on. Each of these are consisting of 3 integers, right? I hope you understand that. And each of those integers is of 4 bytes. So this is how actually it is stored in memory, but conceptually you can think of it like this. Okay, so now let us try to create a program for the same. Okay, so let's include our library stdio.h for input output. Most of the programs we in C language will need this file, right? Then instead of hard coding values 140 and 3 for number of students and number of subjects, let's use some constants. So let's use as defined number of students to be 140 and subjects, let's define another constant called subjects with value 3. What is the benefit of this? So in future, if you ever need to change this, right, number of subjects or number of students, you only need to change it here, and everywhere else where you have used these capital students or subjects, it will automatically change it to the number that you provide here. If you do not do this, and if you use 140 and 3, if you hard code these values in program, then these values will be used at multiple locations in the program, and if you ever need to change any of these, then Let's say if you want to make number of students to 150, then you will need to go to all instances of 140 in the program and change that to 150, and that would be cumbersome, right? And sometimes in loop you might want to go until 139 or 141. That could be a situation like that if you are starting your loop from 1 or something, some weird situation. In that you might even forget to change it to 142 or 138 or something like that, right? So it's always desirable to use constants when and not hard code these values into the program. Okay, so with this out of the way, let's start writing the code inside the main function. So what are the things we need to do? First of all, we need one array, integer array, to store marks of each student. So how many rows should be there? This should be two-dimensional array, as we already talked, and the number of rows should be equal to 140, which is represented by this constant students, and number of columns in each of these rows should be equal to number of subjects, right? Now, as I have already said, that we will calculate percentage of each student, and we will also calculate average of each subject. So for that, let us declare an arrays. So if you think about it, so we have this 140 students here. If we want to store percentage of each student, then each student will require one float number. So if I declare an array like this of type float and call student percentage, then I will require its size to be 140, right? Because for each of the student I want to store percentage. So there would be 140 elements starting from index 0, 1 to 139. So this is a student percentage array. So you can also visualize the same as this standing bar. Actually, this is not two-dimensional array of 139 row, 140 rows and one column. It is not, but it is single dimensional array of 140 float numbers, right? So index 0 of it will store marks of will store percentage of student roll number 1. Index 1 of it will store percentage of roll number 2 at index 1, and so on, right? So it would be like this. Sorry for this. Roll number 1 at index 0, roll number 2 at index 1, roll number 3 at index 2, and so on until roll number 140 at index 139, right? So this is the array to store percentage. Now if we want to store average of each subject, then how many float values do we need? 1 per subject, and we have 3 subjects, then we need 3 values to store the average, right? How would you declare it? So for that you can declare it as float subject average. What should be the size? Size should be 3, as we have 3 subjects. We have hard coded it here, but in program we will not hard code those. So let's declare these arrays, and let us also initialize values of all the elements of both of these arrays to 0, and in a bit I will tell you why is that necessary. Okay, so let's declare float array called student percentage, students percentage, and what should be size? This will contain one entry per student, percentage of each student, right? So size should be equal to number of students. And how to initialize all the elements to 0? If we initialize only one element to 0, compile time initialization, then rest of the elements would be 0 by default, right? So this will initialize all elements of this array to 0. Let's declare another array named subject average. This s is small, okay. Subject average, and this should contain average of each subject. So number of elements should be equal to number of subjects. And let us also initialize all entries in this to 0. Okay. Now to scan into this array from the user, we will need nested loops. So for that we will need a counter control variables. So let's declare ing variables for outer and inner loop, right? Now let us scan into the array, two-dimensional array marks using for loop. For I is equal to 0, and this outer loop for outer for loop will scan marks of students one by one. So one iteration of the outer loop will scan marks of one student. The second iteration of outer loop will scan mark of the next student, and so on, right? So it should iterate how many times? Same as the number of students we are considering. So this should go until I less than student. So if I is starting from 0, and if student is 140, then the valid indices here are until 139. So less than 140. So I will keep going until 139, and this condition will fail at 140, right? I hope everybody understands that. Now let us have inner loop, which will scan marks of each subject for a given student. For first iteration, for roll number 1, it will scan mark of all subjects for roll number 1. When it outer loop iterates second time, this inner loop will again run for each subject and scan marks of the next student for each subject, right? So you will understand it once I write the code. J is less than number of subjects J plus plus. How would you scan into that all the elements of the two-dimensional array? Using scanf statement, right? Scanf, as it is integer array, we will use %t ampersand marks of I j. So with this, one by one you will scan marks of each student. So one outer loop, one iteration of the outer loop will scan marks of one subject. One iteration of outer loop will have multiple iterations of inner loop, which will scan marks of all the subjects for the current student, right? I hope this is clear to everyone. Okay. After scanning marks of all the students for all the subjects, you want to find the percentage of each student at average. So for that, you can have separate loops to find percentage, and you can have separate loops to find the average. That is one of the approach that you can use. Or what you can do is, so we have this array where we are scanning the marks of each student. So at row 0, row 1, row 2, and so on, right? And each row has 3 subjects right now, right? As we have declared subjects as 3, right? So you will scan here first at row 0, column 0, marks of roll number 1 for subjects whose index we are considering 0, then 1, and then 2. So you will scan marks of roll number 1 at index, which are stored at index 0, these, and this. So in one iteration of the outer loop, which will, so one iteration of outer loop will have 3 iterations of inner loop, and you will end up scanning this. Then this condition will fail and it will go out and it will go to the next iteration of the second loop, for which this will execute 3 times and will scan marks of 3 subjects for the next student, and so on, right? But after scanning each of these, right, see, we have 2 separate arrays. One is for storing percentage of each student, and another another at the end of this to store average of each subject, which have 3 elements, one for each subject, one for storing average of each subject. So what if we take this value immediately after scanning it, what if we add it directly to this and we also add it to this, right? After scanning this value, we add to this and we add it to this. After scanning this value, we add it to this and then we add it to this, right? And so on. After scanning this value, we will add it to this and we will add it to this. But after scanning these 3 values and adding it here, you can also immediately find the percentage. But after scanning marks of one student, you cannot find the average, right? This scanning can be done in different way as well. If you have marks available per subject, then you can scan it like this. These marks of all the students for one subject and then marks of all the students for another subject. If you scan it like that, then it will be possible to calculate average immediately, but it will not be possible to calculate percentage immediately, right? So either way, but for now we are scanning it like this for student basis, one student after another. So once we get marks of all the subjects for one student, we can easily calculate the percentage. For this we will have to wait, but at least we can get the total here, right? So let us see what we can do. So instead of finishing our inner and outer loop here, let us whatever marks we have scanned, marks of ij, let us add that to this array which is called student percentage. So now we can write student percentage. What is the index? We have to store it at index I, because we are scanning the marks of I, marks of student whose marks are stored at index I. So student percentage at index I plus equal to whatever it contains, add to that whatever we have scanned recently, which is marks of ij, right? So now you realize, why did I initialize all elements to 0? If it was not initialized to 0, then this would contain, if it was not initialized to 0, then it would contain some garbage. And if it contains garbage, if you add something to it, it will result into garbage. Whatever you add to garbage will result in garbage. So at the end, it will be garbage and we cannot find the percentage. Hence, what I did was initialize it to 0. So whenever you scan first number, you add to it, so it will become some number. You scan second number, you add to it, it will become another number. You scan third number, you add to it, and it will be the final total for that student, right? So that will happen. So initial value is 0. Once we scan marks of 0, 0, it will be added to it. In next iteration of this inner loop, when next marks of the same student for the next subject are scanned, it will be added to this and it will continue for all 3 subjects. Okay. At the same time, while we added this to this, we also want to add it to this array, which is for average, which is called subject average. So how would you do that? Subject average. But please note that each iteration of this inner loop is scanning the marks of different subject, right? So here, when j's value is 0, it is scanning marks for this subject. When j's value is 1, it is scanning marks for this subject. When j's value is 2, it is scanning mark for this subject. So we should store it at j and not I, right? Because we have only 3 elements in the array subject average, right, in this given example, and that is represented by j because it iterates for each subject. I hope you understand this point. If you are not understanding it, please spend some time and try to understand before moving on in the video or before watching the rest part of the video. Pause it here and understand it first, okay? But I hope most of you understand it well. I have taken j here. Okay, after scanning marks of all the subjects for a given student, once you add these and these to it, you can easily calculate percentage here for this, right? What you only need to do, and we are also assuming that this marks for each subject is out of 100. Marks out of 100. This is our assumption, okay? So it becomes easier for us to do the program. So in order to calculate the percentage, only thing you need to do is divide by number of subjects. So what you will do, student percentage for ith student, right? So for index I, when we are here, it means all iterations of this inner loop has been completed, and it means we have already scanned marks of all the subjects for ith student. So we can easily divide it by number of subjects. I hope you understand this shorthand notation. This means student percentage I equal to student percentage I divided by subjects. So if we, whatever value was present here, if we divide it by number of subjects and store it back, we successfully have the percentage of that student, right? After that, but the same thing cannot be done for subject average. I hope you understand that, right? Because after the end of one iteration of the outer loop, we only have these marks. We don't have all the marks for a given subject, marks of all the students for a given subject. And unless and until you have marks of all the students for a given subject, you cannot find the subject average. So you cannot find subject average here. That can be only found once all iterations of outer loop are over, right? So we can have a separate for loop for doing that, for finding the average here. So at the end of all the iterations of the outer loop, once we have the second loop, this will be, once we have second iteration of the outer loop, this will be added here, this will be added here. But when this is added here, this will also be added here because of this statement, right? This one, this, when this is added to this one, immediately after that it will be added here as well. When this is added here, it will also be added here. After that, you calculate percentage of these and move on to scan the next values, which you will add here, 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 this here, this one here, this one here as well, this one here, this one here as well, and so on. So basically at the end of all iterations of the outer loop, you will have the total in place for subject average. Only thing you need to do now is divide that number by number of students. You have total marks for a given subject. So if you divide that by number of students, then you will get average of that subject, right? So how to do that? Let's do it for I is equal to 0. Now instead of moving I to so we are not using I for iterating through all students now. We are using I here for iterating through all subjects here. So I less than subjects. You can definitely use J here if you prefer that way, but I am using I instead. Just trying to show you that it's not restricted, that I is associated with something and J is associated with something, right? Also, we only want to write one statement in this loop, so I will not use body and directly write that statement. What should be that statement? So this is subject average array, right? So for subject average of I, or at index I, what we want to do, we want to divide that value by number of students, so that we get average of that subject. And we will do this for each subject using this loop. So this statement will be executed multiple times, same as the number of subjects, right? So at the end of this loop, we will get average in place as well, right? Now if you want to print the marks, so if let's say if we want to print it in this way, let's say on the output screen, I want the output something like this: 39, 46, 82, and then percentage of that student here. I am not calculating it right now, but percentage here, and then new line, marks of second student, something, that percentage of that student here, and so on. And after percentage of that student here, and after that we want to print the average, right? We don't care about this, but this is the output that we want. We don't need anything here, right? So how can you get this output? Let's try to print whatever we have stored, marks and percentage and average, in this format. So we will use outer loop for printing one row and inner loop for printing each of these marks for each subject. So let's do that. For I is equal to 0, I is less than number of students, because each row corresponds to one student, right? And here let us print marks of each subject using counter j. J is less than number of subjects at hand, right? And then we want to print marks of each subject here, right? So we will simply write printf percentage d and marks of ij, right? After printing marks of each subject for one student, we also want to print the percentage. So once this, in all iterations of inner loop are over, we have these and these in place, basically marks of all the subjects. Now let us print percentage of that student. And if you remember, percentage is in float. We have used float array for that, this float student percentage. So we will use percentage f. Also we should leave some space here, so that there is some space printed after the marks, right? Same goes for this. Some actually at the end we don't need some space, but one thing we can do, after printing this percentage, we want new line, right? So we can print /n here, pardon me, /n, and these percentages are stored in array students. Okay, seems like I have used student percentage everywhere and not students percentage. So let me change this as well to student underscore percentage, so that I don't need to change it everywhere. And if there is if it is left to students somewhere, then it's by mistake, you can correct it. Student underscore percentage of I, right? Because this outer loop is iterating for each student and we want to print percentage of each student, right? After that we will end this. So each iteration of this outer loop will be for one student. This inner loop will run multiple times to print marks of each subject for that student, and then this statement will print the percentage and new line. So at the end of one iteration of this, it will print this much, and our cursor would be in the next line, waiting to print the marks of the next student, right? It will repeat this for all the students, and after that we want to print this line, right? So as you might have already understood that the code that we have written so far will not print this. We'll have to write separate code to print that. Let me separate out this clutter with this line so that you don't get confused. Okay, so for that we need another loop for printing this. So for I equal to 0, I less than number of subjects and I plus plus. Here we will print average of each subject. So printf, and we know that this average is also in the floating point number. So percentage f, some space for this, and the name of this is subject average. So we will have subject average at index I. We will print that for each of the subject, and then this will be printed for 3 subjects, right? With this we have got the output that we wanted. So with this our program is over. So if you understand this correctly, then we have few variables, this for storing marks, this for storing student percentage, this for storing subject average, and ig for loop variables. This outer for loop, this is for scanning marks of all the students for each subject that they have, and along with that, with this statement and this statement, we are adding those marks to the student total and subject total, right? Or basically student percentage, so that we can later calculate student percentage, later we can calculate subject average, but initially we are just totaling with this, right? And here with this, because with all iterations of the inner loop finished, we will have the students total here. So with this we are calculating the students percentage, and once all the iterations of this outer loop are over, we will have marks of all the students and percentage of all the students, but we still don't have subject average. So we calculate subject average by this. By end of all the iterations of this outer loop, we have total for each subject, but we do not have average. So for getting average out of total, we need to divide that total by number of students, so that we get average. So that we are doing for each of this subject using this loop, and then we are having this loop for printing in this particular format. So this for loop, this outer for loop is for printing this rows one by one, and this inner for loop is for printing marks of each of the subject, and percentage will be printed by this statement, right? And then this for loop is printing this subject averages. So with this our program is over. I hope you understood two-dimensional array little better with help of an example. I think I did not do good job of explaining this, but we have explained this in class in details, so I hope everybody understands that. But my main aim was to explain this example, and I hope everybody has understood this example now. Okay, let me zoom it out a little bit so that I can show you a snap of entire program in one screen. So I think this is, if you include str.h, then this is the entire program in one screen. I don't think it is too complex to understand, and I hope everybody understood it well. Thank you for tolerating me.